The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the poolside concrete as Jessica Walsh placed her hand on her barely visible bump and announced, "Marcus and I are having a baby." The entire family barbecue fell silent, except for the sound of my world crumbling. What happened next would expose secrets that destroyed not just my marriage, but an entire family's carefully constructed lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona heat was already unbearable at 10 in the morning, but I was determined to make Marcus's father's 70th birthday barbecue perfect. I had spent 3 weeks planning every detail, from the custom-made decorations in Kevin's favorite colors to the elaborate spread of his preferred dishes. The backyard of our Scottsdale home had been transformed into a celebration, worthy of the family patriarch, who had built Torres Development from nothing into one of Phoenix's most successful real estate companies. Marcus had been acting strangely all week, checking his phone constantly and making hushed calls that ended abruptly whenever I entered the room. When I asked about it, he brushed me off with excuses about work pressures and difficult clients. After 8 years of marriage, I knew when my husband was lying, but I convinced myself it was just stress from organizing such a large family gathering. The guest list included over 40 people, relatives who had flown in from California and New Mexico, longtime family friends, and several employees from Torres Development. I had personally called everyone to confirm attendance, arranged catering, and even hired a photographer to capture what I hoped would be precious family memories. The irony of that decision would become painfully clear within hours. Our marriage had been solid, or so I believed. Marcus and I met in college, both studying business, though I eventually shifted to graphic design while he followed his father into real estate. We built what seemed like a comfortable life together, supporting each other's careers and talking about starting a family once his business partnerships were more established. At 32, I was beginning to feel the biological clock ticking. But Marcus always had reasons to delay. Now I understood why. The morning of the party, Marcus disappeared for 2 hours, claiming he needed to pick up the custom birthday cake. When he returned, he seemed nervous and distracted, barely acknowledging my efforts to coordinate the setup. His behavior struck me as odd, but I was too focused on ensuring everything went smoothly to press the issue. By noon, the backyard was filled with laughter and conversation. Kevin Torres held court near the pool, regaling his grandchildren with stories of his early days in construction. The smell of barbecue filled the air as Marcus's brother David manned the grill. Cold beer flowed freely, and the photographer captured candid moments of the extended Torres family celebrating together. That's when Jessica Walsh arrived. I had met Jessica exactly 3 times during company events, each interaction brief and professional. She was Marcus's newest junior associate, hired 6 months earlier to handle residential listings. Attractive in an understated way, with shoulder-length blonde hair and the kind of confident demeanor that served her well in real estate sales. What struck me as unusual was her attendance at a family celebration. While some employees had been invited, Jessica seemed like an odd choice given her recent hire date and limited relationship with the family. Marcus greeted her with what appeared to be casual friendliness, but I noticed his posture stiffen and his smile become forced. Jessica moved through the crowd with surprising familiarity, chatting easily with Marcus's relatives as if she had known them for years rather than months. When she hugged Kevin Torres and wished him happy birthday, calling him by his first name, rather than the formal Mr. Torres that other employees used, a small alarm bell rang in my mind. The afternoon progressed normally until around 4 o'clock, when Marcus called for everyone's attention to toast his father. The family gathered around the pool area, drinks in hand, as Marcus began what should have been a heartfelt tribute to Kevin's 7 decades of life and achievement. Instead, it became the moment my world imploded. Jessica Walsh stepped forward, interrupting Marcus mid-sentence with a radiant smile that seemed to illuminate her entire face. She placed one hand protectively over her stomach and announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have some wonderful news to share with the family. Marcus and I are having a baby." The silence that followed was deafening. 40-plus people stood frozen, drinks halfway to their lips, conversations cut off mid-sentence, children stopping their pool games to stare at the adults. The only sound was the gentle splash of water against the pool's edge and the distant hum of the air conditioning units working overtime against the desert heat. My champagne glass, which I had been holding in preparation for the toast, slipped from suddenly, numb fingers and shattered against the concrete. The sharp crack of breaking glass seemed to break the spell, and chaos erupted. Kevin Torres's face turned ashen gray, his own drink trembling in his weathered hands. David Torres stepped back from the grill so quickly that he nearly knocked over the propane tank. Marcus's sister-in-law Lisa grabbed her children and pulled them away from the pool area as if protecting them from contamination. But it was Marcus's reaction that confirmed my worst fears. Instead of shock or denial, his face showed only resignation and guilt. He looked directly at me for the first time that day, his dark eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Not remorse exactly, but something closer to relief that his secret was finally exposed. "Amanda," he started, reaching toward me, but I stepped backward so quickly that I nearly fell into the pool myself. "How long?" I managed to whisper, though my voice carried clearly in the stunned silence. Jessica answered before Marcus could speak. 5 months, she said, her hand moving in small circles over her stomach. "We've been together for almost a year, but we wanted to wait until after the first trimester to tell everyone." The mathematical reality hit me like a physical blow. A year. While I had been planning our future, discussing the possibility of children, working extra hours to build my freelance design business so we could afford a larger house, Marcus had been building an entirely different life with someone else. The family barbecues I had organized, the company parties where I had stood beside him as his devoted wife, the nights he claimed to be working late on difficult deals. All of it had been elaborate theater while he conducted his real life elsewhere. Helen Rodriguez, Marcus's aunt and the family matriarch since Kevin's wife passed away 3 years earlier, was the first to find her voice. At 68, Helen had raised 4 children of her own and helped raise Marcus and David after their mother died when they were teenagers. She possessed the kind of quiet authority that commanded respect even in chaos. "Jessica," Helen said, her voice deadly calm, "I think you should leave." "But I'm family now," Jessica protested, her confident demeanor faltering slightly. "Marcus and I are planning to get married once his divorce is finalized." The words "his divorce" hit the assembled crowd like a second bomb. Not only had Marcus been conducting an affair, but he had apparently been planning to end our marriage without bothering to inform me. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt disconnected from my own body, as if watching this scene unfold from somewhere above the chaos. Kevin Torres, despite his age and recent health problems, struggled to his feet with an expression of fury I had never seen before. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get out now, before I do something I'll regret." Marcus finally found his voice. "Dad, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Kevin demanded. "That you've been lying to your wife, your family, your business partners? That you've brought your pregnant mistress to my birthday party to humiliate Amanda in front of everyone who loves her?" The photographer, apparently unsure whether to continue documenting this family drama, had stopped taking pictures and stood awkwardly near the back gate, clearly wishing he could disappear. Several guests began gathering their belongings, the celebration obviously over, but Helen raised her hand to stop them. "Nobody leaves yet," she commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We need to discuss this as a family. Jessica, perhaps finally realizing that her dramatic announcement had not received the warm welcome she had expected, looked uncertainly between Marcus and the exit. "Maybe I should go," she said, though she made no move toward the door. "Yes," I said, speaking for the first time since asking how long the affair had been going on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You should." But as Jessica gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Helen Rodriguez stepped forward with an expression that made everyone pay attention. "Actually," she said, looking directly at Jessica with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, "maybe you should stay. There are some things about this family that you might want to know before you get too comfortable with your new role." The tone in Helen's voice suggested that she knew something the rest of us didn't, and that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything once again. Marcus's face went from guilty resignation to something approaching panic, and for the first time since Jessica's announcement, I felt a spark of hope that perhaps this story wasn't over yet. The family barbecue that was supposed to celebrate Kevin Torres' 70th birthday had become something else entirely. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across our backyard pool, I realized that Jessica Walsh's pregnancy announcement was just the beginning of revelations that would expose secrets reaching back years, involving not just my husband's infidelity, but a web of deception that threatened to destroy the Torres family legacy entirely. Helen Rodriguez was watching Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone who had been keeping score for a very long time, and I suspected that whatever she was about to reveal would shift the balance of power in ways none of us could have anticipated. The broken champagne glass at my feet seemed symbolic of much more than just a ruined toast. It represented the shattering of illusions that had been carefully maintained for far longer than just the duration of Marcus's affair. As the stunned silence stretched on, punctuated only by the sound of the pool filter and distant traffic on Scottsdale Road, I found myself studying the faces around me with new eyes. How many of them had known about Marcus and Jessica? How many family gatherings had been contaminated by this secret? And most importantly, what other secrets were about to be exposed in the aftermath of this very public betrayal? The birthday party was over, but the real drama was just beginning. Helen Rodriguez waited until the last of the uncomfortable guests had shuffled out through our back gate, muttering awkward apologies and promises to call later. The photographer had packed his equipment with record speed, clearly relieved to escape the family drama that had erupted in front of his lens. Only the immediate family remained in our backyard, along with Jessica, who seemed frozen in place, despite multiple suggestions that she leave. The Arizona sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the pool deck where broken glass still glittered from my shattered champagne flute. Kevin Torres had settled heavily into one of the patio chairs, his face still pale from the shock of his son's betrayal being announced at his own birthday celebration. David and Lisa Torres stood protectively near their children, who had been quickly ushered inside to the living room with tablets and snacks. Marcus kept glancing between Jessica and his Aunt Helen, his expression shifting from guilt to something approaching fear. I had never seen my husband look so uncertain, so completely out of his depth. For 8 years, Marcus had been the confident decision-maker in our relationship, the one who handled negotiations and difficult conversations with ease. Now he appeared to be shrinking under Helen's steady gaze. "Jessica," Helen said finally, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to having her words obeyed. "You mentioned that you and Marcus have been together for almost a year. Tell me, when exactly did this relationship begin?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I don't see why that matters now. The important thing is that we're building a future together." "The timing matters very much," Helen replied, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a calendar app. "You see, I keep track of family events, business meetings, important dates. It helps me stay connected to everyone's lives. She looked up from the phone with sharp eyes. Marcus, you hired Jessica in March, correct? 6 months ago? Yes, Marcus answered reluctantly. And Jessica, you just told us you've been together for almost a year. That would put the beginning of your relationship sometime around September of last year. Helen's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. 6 months before Marcus hired you at Torres Development. The implication hung in the air like the lingering smell of barbecue smoke. Jessica's face flushed. Red, and Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but Helen continued before he could formulate a response. So either you're lying about the timeline, or Marcus was conducting an extramarital affair and then used his position to give his mistress a job at the family company. Either way, there are some serious problems with your story. I felt a strange detachment as I listened to Helen dissect the situation with surgical precision. The emotional shock of Jessica's pregnancy announcement was giving way to a cold, analytical clarity. My husband hadn't just cheated on me. He had potentially committed fraud, nepotism, or both. The family business that Kevin Torres had built over decades was being used to facilitate Marcus's affair. It's not like that, Jessica protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus and I fell in love. These things happen. These things, Helen repeated, her tone suggesting she found the phrase distasteful. Let me tell you what else happens, dear. People who think they can manipulate situations for their own benefit often find themselves unprepared for the consequences. David Torres spoke up for the first time since the initial announcement. Marcus, is this true? Did you hire her because you were sleeping with her? Marcus's silence was answer enough. Kevin Torres made a sound of disgust and pushed himself up from his chair with obvious effort. 43 years I've been building this company, he said, his voice shaking with anger. 43 years of honest work, fair dealing, treating employees with respect. And you've turned it into your personal dating service. Dad, it's not that simple, Marcus began, but Kevin cut him off with a wave of his hand. It never is, son. It never is. Kevin turned to Helen. I need to lie down. This day has been too much. As he walked slowly toward the house, he paused next to where I stood. Amanda, I'm sorry. You deserved better than this, and you deserve better than him. After Kevin disappeared inside, Helen turned her attention back to Jessica and Marcus. Now, let's discuss the elephant in the room. This baby you're carrying, Jessica. Are you absolutely certain Marcus is the father? The question hit like a lightning bolt. Jessica's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. Of course he is. How can you even ask that? Because, Helen said, settling into one of the patio chairs with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a long conversation. I've been watching this family's drama unfold for longer than any of you realize. And I've learned that when people are willing to lie about one thing, they're usually lying about several things. Marcus finally found his voice. Aunt Helen, what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Marcus. I'm stating facts. Fact 1, you lied to your wife for months about this affair. Fact 2, you used the family business to employ your mistress. Fact 3, Jessica has made claims about timing that don't add up. Fact 4, neither of you can be trusted to tell the truth about anything. Helen reached into her large purse and pulled out a manila folder that I hadn't noticed before. Which brings me to some information that might interest everyone here. She opened the folder and withdrew several sheets of paper. Even from where I stood, I could see they were printed emails, bank statements, and what appeared to be copies of text messages. You see, when Kevin started having health problems last year, he asked me to help him keep an eye on the business finances. He was worried about making sure everything was in order for succession planning. Marcus's face went completely white. What kind of finances? Oh, various things. Company credit card statements, employee expense reports, payroll records. The kind of mundane paperwork that most people don't pay attention to. Helen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. For instance, Did you know that Torres Development has been paying for a lot of interesting expenses over the past 10 months? She held up one of the papers. Hotel charges in Sedona, Phoenix, even Las Vegas. Always 2 guests, always charged to the company. Restaurant bills for expensive dinners, spa treatments, weekend getaways. She looked directly at Marcus. All authorized by you, all justified as client entertainment expenses. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't just been cheating on me. He had been using company funds to finance his affair. Every romantic weekend with Jessica, every expensive dinner, every hotel room had been paid for by the Torres family business. That's embezzlement, David said quietly. Marcus, please tell me you didn't steal from Dad's company to pay for your affair. It wasn't stealing, Marcus protested weakly. I was going to pay it back. And some of those expenses were legitimate business meetings. Helen flipped to another page. 37 separate charges totaling over $48,000. For perspective, that's more than most of your employees make in a year. She looked at Jessica. Did you know your boyfriend was using stolen money to wine and dine you? Jessica's earlier defiance crumbled completely. I didn't know it was company money. Marcus said he had savings, investments. Which brings us to another interesting discovery, Helen continued, clearly enjoying having the attention of her captive audience. Jessica, you mentioned being together for almost a year. But according to these credit card records, the first hotel charge was 11 months ago, which means your relationship began while Marcus was still married, still living with Amanda, still pretending to be a devoted husband. I felt simultaneously numb and hyper-aware, as if my emotions had been anesthetized while my mind processed information with crystal clarity. The betrayal was even more extensive than I had imagined. Every business trip Marcus had taken, every late night at the office, every weekend conference had potentially been a lie covering his affair with Jessica. But here's the most interesting part, Helen said, producing another document from her folder. Jessica, you said you were 5 months pregnant, which would put conception around 4 months ago. But according to these records, Marcus and you didn't take any trips together during that time period. Everyone stared at Helen, trying to process the implication of her statement. Jessica's face had gone pale, and she seemed to be calculating something in her head. That's impossible, Jessica said finally. The dates must be wrong. The dates are very precise, Helen replied. Credit card companies are quite meticulous about their record keeping. So either you're wrong about when you conceived or you're wrong about who the father is. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after Jessica's initial announcement. This was the silence of people processing information that would change everything they thought they knew. Marcus was staring at Jessica with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, suspicion, dawning realization. Jessica, Marcus said slowly, we need to talk. Privately. No, Helen interjected firmly. Whatever conversation you're going to have, it happens here, in front of everyone. Enough secrets, enough lies, enough private discussions that leave everyone else in the dark. Jessica looked trapped, glancing around at the faces surrounding her as if searching for an ally. Finding none, she seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. The timing might be a little different than I initially calculated, she admitted, reluctantly. A little different how? I asked, speaking for the first time in several minutes. Maybe 6 months instead of 5, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen consulted her papers again. 6 months ago would be March. According to these records, Marcus was in Denver for a real estate conference the entire second week of March. Alone. No company credit card charges for 2 people, no hotel bills for romantic getaways. The web of lies was unraveling in real time. Jessica's story was falling apart under Helen's methodical questioning, and I found myself feeling an unexpected alliance with this woman who was systematically exposing the truth that Marcus and Jessica had tried to hide. Who were you with in March, Jessica? Helen asked quietly. Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her face as she admitted, there was someone else. Before Marcus. But when I found out I was pregnant, I thought maybe it could be Marcus's baby too. And he was the one with money, with stability. The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. He staggered backward, nearly falling into the pool. You're telling me this might not even be my child? I don't know, Jessica sobbed. I honestly don't know. The timing was close enough that it could be either of you. David Torres shook his head in disgust. So you destroyed Marcus's marriage, humiliated Amanda in front of the entire family, and announced a pregnancy that might not even involve our family? And used the announcement to stake a claim on the Torres family money and business, Helen added grimly. Very calculated, Jessica. Or it would have been, if you had been smarter about covering your tracks. I looked at Helen Rodriguez with new respect. This woman had systematically gathered evidence, analyzed timelines, and exposed lies that could have continued for months or even years. Without her intervention, I might have spent years believing that my husband had simply fallen in love with someone else, never knowing about the embezzlement, the calculated deception, or the uncertainty about the baby's paternity. Helen, I said quietly, why did you do this? Why did you gather all this information? Helen's expression softened slightly as she looked at me. Because, Amanda, I've watched this family for 68 years. I helped raise Marcus and David when their mother died. I've seen Kevin work himself to exhaustion building something honest and valuable. And I've watched you be a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, a good addition to this family. She gestured toward the house where Kevin had gone to rest. When someone tries to destroy something good, something that took decades to build, you don't just stand by and let it happen. You fight back. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Our pool lights had automatically turned on, casting wavering reflections on the water's surface. The broken champagne glass had been swept up by one of the departing guests, but the memory of its shattering remained sharp and clear. Marcus finally spoke, his voice hollow. What happens now? Helen closed her folder and stood up from the patio chair. Now, Marcus, you have some choices to make. You can continue lying and see where that gets you, or you can start telling the truth and maybe salvage something from this disaster. She looked at Jessica, who was still crying quietly. And you, young lady, need to figure out who actually fathered your child before you make any more announcements about family relationships. As Helen walked toward the house, she paused next to where I stood. Amanda, why don't you walk me inside? I think we need to have a conversation about your options. Following Helen into the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Jessica's pregnancy announcement several hours earlier. Hope. Not hope for my marriage, which was clearly over, but hope that maybe the story wasn't finished. That maybe there were ways to ensure that justice was served and truth was revealed. Behind us, Marcus and Jessica remained by the pool, their hushed conversation carrying the tone of people trying to figure out how to contain a disaster that had already spiraled completely out of control. But ahead of us, Helen Rodriguez walked, with the confident stride of someone who had more cards to play, more information to reveal, and more plans to execute. The family barbecue was long over, but the real confrontation was just beginning. Helen Rodriguez led me through the sliding glass doors into our living room, where the contrast between the chaos outside and the normal family gathering remnants inside felt surreal. Kevin Torres sat in Marcus's favorite recliner, his breathing labored and his color still poor. The stress of the afternoon's revelations had clearly taken a physical toll on the 70-year-old patriarch. Kevin needs rest, but he also needs to hear what we're planning, Helen said quietly, settling onto the couch across from her brother-in-law. What happened today wasn't just a personal betrayal, Amanda. It was an attack on everything this family has built. I took a seat beside Helen, still processing the magnitude of what she had revealed outside. The embezzlement alone was serious enough to destroy Marcus's career and potentially send him to prison. But the uncertainty about Jessica's baby's paternity added another layer of complexity that I was still trying to understand. "How long have you known?" I asked Helen. "About the affair, the stolen money, all of it?" Helen reached into her purse and withdrew a small notebook, its pages filled with her neat handwriting. "I started noticing irregularities about 8 months ago. Kevin asked me to help review the quarterly financial reports because his vision has been getting worse. Little things at first, expense reports that seemed excessive, travel costs that didn't match up with known business meetings." She flipped through several pages, each one documenting dates, amounts, and suspicious transactions. "Then I started paying attention to Marcus's behavior during family gatherings. Phone calls he would step away to take, changes in his schedule. That didn't make sense. A general nervousness whenever business finances came up in conversation." Kevin spoke up from his chair, his voice weary but determined. "Helen came to me 6 weeks ago with her concerns. We decided to conduct a more thorough investigation before making any accusations." "What kind of investigation?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Helen smiled grimly. "The kind that a retired nurse with much time on her hands and a healthy suspicion of people's motives can conduct. I followed Marcus on 3 separate occasions when he claimed to be meeting clients. Each time, he went to meet Jessica instead. The revelation that Helen had been conducting surveillance on my husband felt both violating and vindicating. She had been protecting the family's interests while I remained obliviously trusting, planning birthday parties and organizing family gatherings that Marcus was using as cover for his deception. "I have photographs," Helen continued, producing an envelope from her purse. Marcus and Jessica at restaurants, holding hands, kissing in parking lots. Time-stamped images that correspond with company credit card charges for supposed business meetings. Looking at the photographs felt like viewing evidence of a crime, which in many ways it was. The images showed my husband in moments of intimacy with another woman, moments that coincided with lies he had told me about work obligations and client dinners. Each photograph represented another night I had spent alone, trusting his explanations and never questioning his absence. "But the pregnancy announcement today changes everything," Helen said, returning the photographs to her purse. "If Jessica is lying about the paternity, or even just uncertain about it, then she's essentially committed fraud by claiming a relationship to our family that may not exist." Kevin leaned forward in his chair, some of his earlier color returning, as he focused on the legal implications. "Helen, what exactly are you proposing we do with this information?" "We force the truth," Helen replied without hesitation. "Jessica made a public claim about carrying Marcus's child. We demand a paternity test to verify that claim. If she's lying, we expose her publicly just as she tried to humiliate Amanda publicly." The idea of turning Jessica's own tactics against her appealed to me in a way that surprised me. Throughout our marriage, I had always taken the high road, avoided confrontation, tried to be the peacemaker in family disputes. But the calculated nature of Jessica's betrayal, combined with Marcus's systematic theft from his own family's business, had awakened something harder and more determined in the "what if the test proves Marcus is the father?" I asked. "Then we deal with that reality," Helen said pragmatically. "But either way, we expose the embezzlement, we document the lies, and we make sure there are consequences for what they've done to this family." Through the sliding glass doors, I could see Marcus and Jessica still talking by the pool, their conversation appearing increasingly heated. Jessica was gesturing emphatically while Marcus shook his head repeatedly. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear they couldn't agree on their next steps. "There's something else," Kevin said quietly. "Something I haven't told anyone, including Marcus. The company's insurance policy and my personal will both have specific clauses about embezzlement and fraud. If Marcus is found guilty of stealing from Torres Development, he loses all inheritance rights and can be held personally liable for damages. This information hit me like another shockwave. Marcus wasn't just risking his marriage and his relationship with his family, he was potentially forfeiting his entire financial future. The business he expected to inherit, the security he thought he was building, all of it could disappear if his theft was properly documented and prosecuted. "How much inheritance are we talking about?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why the figure mattered to me personally. Kevin and Helen exchanged a look that suggested they had discussed this topic extensively. "Torres Development is worth approximately $8 million, Kevin said slowly. "My personal assets, including real estate investments and retirement accounts, add another $3 million to that total. $11 million. Marcus had risked an $11 million inheritance to conduct an affair with a woman who might be carrying another man's child. The magnitude of his poor judgment was staggering. But here's what Marcus doesn't know," Helen continued, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "Kevin updated his will 3 months ago, after I brought him my initial concerns about the financial irregularities." Kevin nodded slowly. "The new will includes provisions that protect the business and ensure it goes to someone who will run it ethically. If Marcus is found guilty of embezzlement, his portion of the inheritance goes to a trust that will benefit you, Amanda, and any children you might have in the future." The conversation was moving into territory I hadn't expected. Not only was Helen proposing to expose Marcus and Jessica's lies, but Kevin was revealing that he had already taken steps to protect me financially in case the worst-case scenarios came true. "Why would you do that for me?" I asked Kevin, genuinely confused by his generosity toward a daughter-in-law whose marriage to his son was clearly ending. "Because," Kevin said, his voice growing stronger, "you've been more of a true family member to me over the past 8 years than my own son has been over the past 8 months. You remembered my medication schedule when Marcus forgot. You organized my doctor's appointments when Marcus was too busy. You treated me with respect and kindness while my own son was stealing from me to pay for his affair." The emotional weight of Kevin's words combined with the stress of the day's revelations finally broke through my shock. Tears began streaming down my face as I realized that while I was losing my husband, I was gaining something else. A family that valued me for who I was rather than just my role as Marcus's wife. Helen handed me a tissue and waited for me to compose myself before continuing. "Amanda, what we're proposing isn't just about revenge, though I won't lie and say that's not part of it. It's about justice and truth. Jessica made a public claim, and we have the right to demand proof of that claim." "How would we even arrange a paternity test?" I asked, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the emotional implications of everything I was learning. "Leave that to me," Helen said with confidence. "I still have connections in the medical field from my nursing career. Getting a court-ordered paternity test won't be difficult, especially given the financial implications of Jessica's claims." Through the window, I could see that Marcus and Jessica's conversation had ended. Jessica was walking toward the back gate while Marcus remained standing by the pool, his head in his hands. Whatever they had discussed, it was clear they hadn't reached any resolution that satisfied either of them. "She's leaving," I observed. "Good," Helen said firmly. "Let her go home and think about the situation she's created. Sometimes people make better decisions when they have time to consider the full consequences of their actions." Marcus came through the sliding glass doors a few minutes later, his face showing the strain of the day's events. He looked at the 3 of us sitting together and seemed to realize that we had been planning something in his absence. "What's going on?" he asked warily. Helen answered before I could speak. "We're discussing your options, Marcus. You can tell us the truth about everything. The affair, the embezzlement, your real relationship with Jessica. Or we can proceed with legal action that will expose everything anyway." Marcus slumped into a chair across from us, suddenly, looking much older than his 34 years. "What do you want to know?" "Start with the money," Kevin said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built a successful business through decades of honest work. How much did you steal, and how long has it been going on? I didn't steal anything, Marcus Torres protested weakly. I borrowed against future earnings. I was planning to pay it all back. Borrowing requires permission, Helen interjected. Taking money without authorization is theft, regardless of your intentions to repay it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his options. Finally, he seemed to realize that continued denial was pointless. About $50,000 over the past 10 months. Most of it went to travel expenses, restaurants, hotels. Some of it went to jewelry. Jewelry for Jessica? I asked, though I already knew the answer. A necklace for her birthday, earrings for Christmas, nothing too expensive, Marcus said, as if the cost made the betrayal more acceptable. Christmas, I repeated, the timeline hitting me with fresh pain. You bought your mistress Christmas jewelry while I was shopping for gifts for your family. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the full picture of Marcus's deception. Not only had he been conducting an affair and stealing money to finance it, but he had been doing so during holidays and family celebrations that I had organized and planned. Helen consulted her notebook again. Marcus, Jessica claimed today that you've been together for almost a year. She also claimed to be 5 months pregnant. Later, she admitted the pregnancy might be 6 months along. We need to know the exact timeline of your relationship with her. Marcus looked trapped, glancing between his father, his aunt, and me as if searching for some way to avoid answering. Finding no escape, he began talking with the resignation of someone who knew his secrets were already exposed. We met at a real estate networking event in September. We started talking, had coffee a few times. It was just talking at first, but by October we were seeing each other regularly. He paused, clearly struggling with what to say next. The physical relationship started in November. And you hired her in March, Helen observed. 4 months after you started sleeping with her. She needed a job. She was good at sales. It made sense from a business perspective, Marcus said, though his words lacked conviction. It made sense from the perspective of keeping your mistress close and using company resources to support your affair, Kevin corrected grimly. What it didn't make sense from was an ethical business perspective. Helen flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. Marcus, based on your timeline, if Jessica is 6 months pregnant, conception would have occurred around the time you hired her. Is that consistent with your relationship? Marcus considered the question, and I could see him doing calculations in his head. Maybe. The timing could work, but Jessica was acting strange around that time, distracted, sometimes unavailable. When I called. Strange how? Helen pressed. Canceling dates at the last minute, not answering her phone for days at a time. When I asked about it, she said she was dealing with family issues, Marcus explained. I thought she was just stressed about starting a new job. Or she was managing relationships with multiple men and trying to keep her stories straight, Helen suggested bluntly. The possibility that Jessica had been juggling multiple relationships while conducting her affair with Marcus added another layer of deception to an already complex situation. If she had been uncertain about the baby's paternity from the beginning, her decision to publicly claim Marcus as the father at Kevin's birthday party represented a calculated gamble rather than a simple announcement of happy news. We need to contact an attorney, Helen said decisively. Someone who specializes in both family law and corporate fraud. The embezzlement charges and the paternity question need to be handled simultaneously. Kevin nodded in agreement. I know someone. Patricia Newman has handled legal matters for Torres Development for 15 years. She's tough, smart, and she understands the business implications of this situation. The mention of involving attorneys made everything feel more real and more serious. What had started as a family barbecue gone wrong was evolving into a legal battle that could result in criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the complete destruction of Marcus's personal and professional life. "Amanda," Helen said, turning to face me directly, "you need to decide how involved you want to be in this process. You can file for divorce and walk away, or you can help us ensure that Marcus and Jessica face appropriate consequences for what they've done." The choice Helen was offering me was really no choice at all. Walking away would mean allowing Marcus and Jessica to potentially escape accountability for their actions. It would mean letting the embezzlement go unpunished and allowing Jessica to make false claims about the Torres family if her pregnancy announcement proved to be based on lies. "I want to be involved," I said firmly. "I want the truth exposed, and I want there to be consequences." Helen smiled with satisfaction. "Good. Then we start tomorrow. Patricia Newman, paternity test arrangements, financial audits, and a comprehensive strategy for ensuring that justice is served." As the sun finished setting behind the mountains west of Phoenix, casting our living room in shadows, I realized that the family barbecue disaster was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Marcus and Jessica had made the mistake of underestimating the people they had betrayed, and they were about to discover that Helen Rodriguez and Kevin Torres were not the kind of opponents who would accept defeat quietly. The broken champagne glass from earlier in the day had been cleaned up, but the shattered illusions it represented were about to be replaced by something much stronger, a determination to fight back and ensure that the truth prevailed, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be for everyone involved. Patricia Newman arrived at our house the following Tuesday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of sharp business suit that commanded immediate respect. At 55, she had the bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating complex legal battles and emerging victorious more often than not. Her silver hair was pulled back in a professional chignon, and her piercing blue eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the Torres family gathered around our dining room table. Helen had spent the weekend organizing every piece of evidence she had collected over the past months. Bank statements, credit card receipts, photographs, and her detailed notebook were arranged in chronological order across the mahogany surface. Kevin Torres sat at the head of the table, his color improved from the weekend, but his expression grim as he contemplated the legal action they were about to initiate against his own son. Marcus had been conspicuously absent since Sunday evening, claiming he needed time to think about the situation. His absence felt like another abandonment, but I was discovering that Helen Rodriguez's methodical approach to problem-solving was far more reliable than any support Marcus had ever provided. Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a digital recorder, legal pad, and several manila folders. "Before we begin, I need everyone to understand that what we discuss here today is protected by attorney-client privilege. However, if we proceed with legal action, much of this information will become part of the public record." She looked directly at me. "Amanda, you need to be certain you want to pursue this course of action. Once we file charges for embezzlement and request court-ordered paternity testing, there's no putting this situation back in the box." The question forced me to examine my motivations more deeply than I had over the past few days. Was I seeking justice or revenge? Did it matter if the end result was the same? After 8 years of marriage, I had been publicly humiliated by a woman claiming to carry my husband's child, only to discover that the claim itself might be fraudulent. "I want the truth," I said finally. "Whatever that truth turns out to be." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Then let's establish exactly what we know versus what we suspect." She activated the digital recorder and began methodically reviewing Helen's evidence, asking pointed questions about dates, amounts, and the chain of custody for various documents. The embezzlement case was straightforward. Marcus had used company credit cards for personal expenses totaling $52,847 over 11 months. He had falsified expense reports by claiming personal expenditures were business-related. He had authorized payments to vendors for services that were never provided to the company, then pocketed the refunds. The paper trail was comprehensive and damning. "This is a clear case of corporate fraud," Patricia said after reviewing the financial documentation. The amounts involved make it a felony under Arizona law. Kevin, as the primary owner of Torres Development, you have the right to press criminal charges, pursue civil recovery, or both. Kevin's hands trembled slightly as he signed the complaint Patricia had prepared. Authorizing the prosecution of his own son clearly caused him physical pain, but his voice remained steady. Marcus made his choices. Now he has to face the consequences. The paternity question proved more complex legally. Jessica's public announcement at the family barbecue constituted a claim that, if false, could be considered fraud, particularly given the financial implications for the Torres family estate. However, proving fraud required demonstrating intent to deceive, which was difficult without additional evidence of Jessica's knowledge that Marcus might not be the father. We need to approach this strategically, Patricia explained. First, we request voluntary paternity testing. If Jessica refuses, we petition the court for mandatory testing based on her public claims and the financial implications of those claims. Either way, we get the truth. Helen had been taking notes throughout Patricia's explanation, her pen moving steadily across a fresh page of her notebook. What about Jessica's employment at Torres Development? If she was hired because of her relationship with Marcus rather than her qualifications, that could constitute additional fraud. Nepotism isn't necessarily illegal unless it violates company policies or involves misrepresentation, Patricia replied. However, if Jessica lied on her job application or Marcus falsified her credentials, that would be actionable. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in our driveway. Through the front window, I could see Marcus getting out of his BMW, followed by Jessica emerging from a red Honda Civic. They appeared to be arguing as they walked toward the front door, their body language tense and confrontational. Helen immediately began gathering the evidence documents spread across the table. They probably know we're meeting with an attorney. Word travels fast in business circles. Marcus entered without knocking, using his key as if nothing had changed between us since Sunday's revelations. Jessica followed behind him, looking nervous and uncertain. She had dressed professionally in a navy blue blazer and skirt, but her face showed the strain of the past few days. We need to talk, Marcus announced, taking in the scene around the dining room table with obvious alarm. This has gone far enough. Patricia didn't look up from her legal pad. Mr. Torres, I'm Patricia Newman, attorney for your father and the Torres Development Company. Are you here to discuss voluntary restitution for the embezzled funds? The directness of Patricia's question caught Marcus off guard. He had clearly expected to find a family meeting he could influence through emotional appeals rather than a formal legal consultation already in progress. I didn't embezzle anything, Marcus said, though his protest lacked conviction. Those were legitimate business expenses. For your personal affair, Helen interjected coldly, documented with receipts, photographs, and bank records. Jessica stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. Look, there's been a misunderstanding. Marcus and I are trying to handle this situation maturely. We don't need lawyers and court battles. Actually, Patricia said, finally looking up from her notes, we do. Ms. Walsh, you made a public claim about the paternity of your unborn child. That claim has significant financial and legal implications for the Torres family. We need verification of your assertion. The room fell silent as everyone processed Patricia's clinical approach to what Marcus and Jessica probably considered a private family matter. The attorney's presence had transformed the emotional chaos of Sunday's barbecue into a formal legal proceeding with documented evidence and specific accusations. Jessica's face flushed red, but she maintained her composure. I don't have to prove anything to you. This is between Marcus and me. No, Ms. Walsh, it's not, Kevin said, speaking for the first time since Marcus and Jessica's arrival. You made your announcement at my birthday party in front of my entire family. You made it everyone's business. Helen opened one of her folders and withdrew a photograph showing Marcus and Jessica at an expensive restaurant in Sedona. The image was time-stamped and corresponded to a company credit card charge for $387. This dinner was paid for with Torres Development funds and listed as a client meeting with Pinnacle Properties. I called Pinnacle Properties yesterday. They have no record of any meeting with Marcus on that date. Additional photographs followed, each one corresponding to falsified expense reports and misappropriated company funds. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, and completely undeniable. Marcus's face grew paler with each image as he realized the extent of Helen's investigation. "How long have you been spying on me?" Marcus demanded. "Long enough to document your theft of over $50,000 from the family business," Helen replied without emotion. "The question now is whether you're going to cooperate with restitution and admit your fraud, or whether we proceed with criminal charges." Jessica looked back and forth between Marcus and the assembled family members, as if finally understanding that the situation was far more serious than she had realized. "Marcus, you told me that money came from your personal savings." "It did," Marcus said desperately. "I mean, it will. I was going to replace it with bonuses and commissions from upcoming deals." Patricia made a note on her legal pad. "Mr. Torres, that's an admission of taking money without authorization with the intent to replace it later. In legal terms, that's embezzlement, regardless of your future earnings projections." The trap was closing around Marcus with precision. Every word he spoke to defend his actions only provided additional evidence of his guilt. Jessica was beginning to realize that her association with Marcus had made her an accessory to crimes she hadn't known were being committed. "What do you want?" Marcus asked finally, his voice defeated. "The truth," I said, speaking directly to Jessica. "You're going to take a paternity test to verify your claims about the baby's father." Jessica's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of agreeing readily, as someone confident in their assertion would, she became defensive and evasive. "That's invasive and unnecessary. I know who the father is." "Then you should have no problem proving it," Helen said simply. Patricia reached into her briefcase and withdrew a document that had been prepared in advance. "Ms. Walsh, this is a voluntary agreement for paternity testing. You can sign it now, or we can petition the court for mandatory testing. Either way, the test will happen." The legal document transformed Jessica's vague claims into a specific challenge that required a definitive response. She could no longer rely on emotional appeals or avoid the question of paternity through deflection and delay tactics. "I need to think about this," Jessica said, reaching for the document but not immediately signing it. "Think about what?" Kevin asked. "Either Marcus is the father of your child, or he isn't. The test will simply confirm what you've already claimed to know." Jessica's hesitation was answer enough for everyone in the room. If she had been certain about the baby's paternity, agreeing to testing would have been straightforward. Her reluctance suggested doubt about her own claims, which raised questions about why she had made such a public announcement in the first place. Marcus was staring at Jessica with growing suspicion. "Jessica, is there something you're not telling me?" "It's complicated," Jessica admitted, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "It's really not," Patricia interjected. "Either you were having intimate relations with only Marcus during the conception timeframe, or you were involved with multiple partners. If it's the latter, your public claim about Marcus being the father was premature at best, fraudulent at worst." The clinical language stripped away any romantic notions about Jessica's situation and reduced it to the legal and financial realities that her announcement had created. She had staked a claim on the Torres family fortune based on assertions she apparently couldn't support with confidence. Helen consulted her notebook again. "Jessica, when you first told Marcus about the pregnancy, what exactly did you say?" Jessica glanced at Marcus before answering. "I told him I was pregnant and that he was the father." "Did you tell him there?" Was any possibility that someone else could be the father? Helen pressed. No, Jessica said quietly. But you knew there was another possibility, Helen continued relentlessly. Jessica's silence was confirmation enough. She had deliberately misled Marcus about the paternity question, allowing him to believe he was definitely the father when she knew there was uncertainty. Her decision to make a public announcement at the family barbecue represented a calculated gamble designed to force the Torres family to accept her claims without verification. Who else could be the father? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica looked trapped, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape route. Finding none, she finally answered. Someone I was seeing before we got serious. The timing overlapped by a few weeks. A few weeks or a few months? Patricia asked, her pen poised over her legal pad. Maybe 6 weeks, Jessica admitted. The admission revealed the depth of Jessica's deception. She had been involved with another man during the same period she was beginning her relationship with Marcus, creating uncertainty about paternity that she had deliberately concealed. Her decision to publicly claim Marcus as the father appeared to be based on financial considerations rather than biological certainty. Marcus slumped into one of the dining room chairs, the full implications of Jessica's admissions finally hitting him. Not only had he destroyed his marriage and stolen from his family's business for a woman who had been lying to him, but he had done so for a child that might not even be his. We're doing the paternity test, Marcus said firmly, looking directly at Jessica. I need to know the truth. Jessica realized she was cornered. Refusing the test would make her look guilty and potentially subject her to court-ordered testing anyway. Agreeing to it meant risking the exposure of her lies if Marcus wasn't the father. Fine, she said, reaching for the pen Patricia offered. But I want it clear that this is under protest. As Jessica signed the voluntary testing agreement, Helen made one final note in her notebook. The investigation that had begun with suspicious credit card charges had uncovered systematic embezzlement, deliberate deception, and potentially fraudulent claims about family relationships. What started as a family barbecue had become a comprehensive, legal reckoning that would determine not just the truth about Jessica's pregnancy, but the future of the Torres family business and fortune. Patricia collected the signed document and returned it to her briefcase. The testing can be arranged. For this week, results typically take 7 to 10 days. Once we have those results, we'll know exactly what legal actions are appropriate. As the meeting concluded, I realized that the uncertainty of the past few days was about to be resolved definitively. The DNA test would either confirm Jessica's claims or expose them as lies, but either way, the truth would finally be revealed. Marcus and Jessica had gambled that their deception could be maintained through emotional manipulation and public pressure. But they had underestimated the determination of people who valued truth over convenience. The paternity test was scheduled for Thursday morning at a certified laboratory in Phoenix. Helen had insisted on accompanying Jessica to ensure there was no opportunity for sample tampering or substitution. Patricia had arranged for expedited processing of the results, which would be available the following Wednesday. 7 days to discover whether the public humiliation of our family barbecue had been based on truth or lies. 7 days to determine whether Marcus had destroyed his marriage and stolen from his family for a child that was actually his, or for a woman who had been playing multiple men against each other while calculating which relationship offered the best financial prospects. As Marcus and Jessica left the house, their departure marked by uncomfortable silence rather than the arguments that had characterized their arrival, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. The truth was coming, whether they were prepared for it or not. The DNA test results arrived on a crisp Wednesday morning in October, exactly 10 days after Jessica Walsh had reluctantly provided her saliva sample at the Phoenix laboratory. Patricia Newman called at 7:30 in the morning, her voice professionally neutral, but carrying an undertone of satisfaction that suggested the results would be significant. The paternity test results are in, Patricia said without preamble. Can everyone meet at your house this afternoon? 2 o'clock would be ideal. I agreed immediately, then spent the morning in a strange state of suspended animation, alternating between nervous energy that had me cleaning rooms that were already spotless and periods of complete stillness where I stared out the window at our backyard pool, remembering the moment 10 days earlier when Jessica's announcement had shattered my world like a champagne glass hitting concrete. Helen Rodriguez arrived first, carrying her ever-present notebook and a manila envelope that I assumed contained additional documentation she had gathered during the waiting period. Kevin Torres came with her, moving slowly but with determination, his color much improved from the stress-induced pallor he had displayed during Jessica's pregnancy announcement. "How are you holding up?" Helen asked, settling onto the living room couch with the familiarity of someone who had become my closest ally over the past week and a half. I keep oscillating between hoping Marcus isn't the father, which would prove Jessica was lying, and hoping he is the father, which would mean there's at least one innocent child in this mess, I admitted. Kevin lowered himself carefully into his preferred recliner. "Either way, Amanda, this family owes you an apology for what you've been put through. Regardless of what those test results say, Marcus destroyed your marriage through his own choices." Patricia Newman arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her leather briefcase containing what would either vindicate Jessica's claims or expose them as calculated lies. She had requested that Marcus and Jessica attend the meeting, though neither had confirmed their participation. The uncertainty about whether they would show up added another layer of tension to an already charged atmosphere. Marcus arrived alone at 2:15, looking haggard and older than his 34 years. He had clearly been struggling with the implications of the pending test results, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something approaching vulnerability. He nodded awkwardly to his father and aunt before taking a seat across the room from where I sat, maintaining physical distance that reflected our emotional separation. "Where's Jessica?" Patricia asked directly. "She said she needed to work," Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. "She'll accept whatever the results show." Helen made a note in her notebook, her expression indicating that Jessica's absence was itself significant. Interesting that she wouldn't want to be here when the results of her public claims are revealed. Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the laboratory's official letterhead. The moment felt surreal, as if the past 10 days of legal maneuvering and family tension were about to be resolved by a single sheet of paper containing scientific data that would definitively answer questions that had consumed all of our thoughts. "Before I open these results," Patricia said, "I want everyone to understand their implications. If Marcus is determined to be the father, Jessica's claims are validated, but Marcus still faces criminal charges for embezzlement and will need to address his financial obligations to both his child and Torres Development." She paused, looking around the room at each of us. If Marcus is not the father, Jessica has made fraudulent claims about this family, potentially exposing herself to civil liability for the emotional distress and financial costs her false statements have caused. The legal framework Patricia outlined made clear that regardless of the test results, there would be consequences for the actions that had brought us to this point. Marcus's embezzlement was a separate crime from Jessica's paternity claims, and both issues would need to be resolved through the legal system. Patricia carefully opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. She read silently for a moment, her professional composure giving away nothing about the contents. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she reviewed the technical details of the DNA analysis. "The results are conclusive," Patricia announced finally. "Based on the genetic markers analyzed, Marcus Torres is excluded as the biological father of Jessica Walsh's unborn child. The probability of paternity is 0%. The words hit the room like a physical force. Marcus's face went completely white, then several shades of red as the implications sank in. Not only had Jessica been lying about the paternity, but She had made her false claims publicly, at a family celebration, in front of dozens of witnesses. Kevin Torres was the first to speak. "She knew," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and vindication. Jessica knew there was doubt about the paternity, but she chose to make her announcement anyway. Helen's notebook appeared in her hands as she began documenting the moment. This means Jessica committed deliberate fraud. She made false claims about family relationships for financial gain, caused emotional distress through her deception, and potentially influenced Marcus's business decisions based on lies. Marcus sat in stunned silence, apparently still processing the reality that he had destroyed his marriage, stolen from his family's company, and risked his entire future for a woman who had been systematically deceiving him about the most fundamental aspect of their relationship. "Marcus," I said, speaking directly to my husband for the first time since the results were announced. "Did you know there was any doubt about the paternity?" "No," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "She told me I was the only one. She said the baby was definitely mine." Patricia made notes on her legal pad as Marcus spoke. "Mr. Torres, you're confirming that Ms. Walsh explicitly told you that you were the only possible father of her child?" "Yes, multiple times. When she first told me about the pregnancy, when we discussed telling the family, when we planned the announcement at Dad's birthday party." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he apparently realized the extent of Jessica's deception. "She knew I wouldn't have participated in the public announcement if there was any uncertainty." The revelation that Jessica had deliberately misled Marcus about the paternity added another dimension to her fraud. Not only had she made false claims to the Torres family, but she had manipulated Marcus into becoming an unwitting accomplice in her deception. Helen flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. "Patricia, what are our legal options regarding Jessica's fraudulent claims?" "Multiple avenues," Patricia replied, consulting her own notes. "Civil fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, potentially criminal fraud depending on whether she received any financial benefits based on her false claims. If Marcus gave her money or gifts believing he was supporting his child, that could constitute theft by deception." The legal terminology was transforming Jessica's personal betrayal into a series of actionable crimes that could result in both civil liability and criminal prosecution. Her calculated decision to make false paternity claims was revealing itself as a serious legal miscalculation. Marcus suddenly looked up from his contemplation with a stricken expression. "The jewelry. I bought her jewelry for her birthday and Christmas, expensive pieces. I told her it was to celebrate our future together and the baby." "How expensive?" Patricia asked. "About $8,000 total. A diamond necklace, matching earrings, a bracelet," Marcus replied. "I used company credit cards for those purchases too, but I justified it as celebrating the future Torres heir." Helen's pen moved rapidly across her notebook. "So Jessica received jewelry worth $8,000 based on her false claims about carrying Marcus's child, and those purchases constituted additional embezzlement from Torres Development." The financial implications of Jessica's fraud were growing more complex as each revelation exposed new layers of deception. She had not only made false claims about paternity, but had materially benefited from those lies through expensive gifts that Marcus had purchased with stolen money. "We need to contact Jessica immediately," Patricia declared. "She needs to be informed of the test results and given an opportunity to return the jewelry voluntarily before we proceed with criminal charges." Marcus pulled out his phone and attempted to call Jessica, but the call went directly to voicemail. He tried texting with no immediate response. After several attempts, it became clear that Jessica was avoiding contact, probably anticipating that the DNA results would not support her claims. "Her avoidance is itself significant," Patricia observed. "Someone confident in their claims would want to know the results immediately. Someone who knows they've been lying would avoid the conversation as long as possible." Helen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where Jessica had made her fraudulent announcement 10 days earlier. She's probably calculating her next move. The question is whether she tries to disappear, double down on her lies, or attempt to negotiate some kind of settlement. The three options Helen outlined represented different levels of guilt and desperation. Jessica's choice would reveal how calculated her original deception had been, and whether she was prepared to face the legal consequences of her actions. Marcus's phone finally buzzed with a text message from Jessica. He read it silently, his expression shifting from hope to disgust as he processed her words. "What does it say?" Kevin asked. Marcus held up the phone for everyone to see. The message read, "I know what the results probably show. I never meant for things to go this far. Can we work something out privately?" Patricia reached for her phone. "Mr. Torres, would you be willing to respond to that message under my direction? We need to establish Jessica's acknowledgement of her deception for the record." Marcus nodded, apparently eager to participate in exposing the truth after being manipulated for months. Patricia dictated a response that Marcus typed and sent. "Jessica, the family is here with our attorney. The DNA test proves you lied about the paternity. We need to discuss the return of the jewelry and your fraudulent claims." The response came within minutes. "I can explain everything. This doesn't have to become a legal matter. I'll give back the jewelry." Helen looked up from her notebook with satisfaction. That's an admission of guilt. She's acknowledging that the jewelry should be returned, which implies she knows she obtained it through false pretenses. Patricia was already drafting legal documents on her laptop. "We'll give Jessica one opportunity to return the jewelry voluntarily and provide a written admission of her fraudulent claims. If she refuses, we proceed with both civil and criminal charges." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through our living room windows, casting long shadows across the furniture where Marcus and I had spent 8 years building what I thought was a solid marriage. The irony that Jessica's lies were being exposed in the same room where we had celebrated anniversaries and planned our future together wasn't lost on me. "Amanda," Kevin said, drawing my attention back to the present moment, "I want you to know that regardless of how this legal situation resolves, my offer stands. The updated will includes provisions that protect you financially, and I meant what I said about considering you true family." The generosity Kevin was showing me, even as he dealt with his son's betrayal of the family business, represented the kind of integrity that Marcus had apparently inherited only selectively. Kevin's willingness to support me while prosecuting his own son for embezzlement demonstrated a commitment to justice over favoritism. Marcus looked up from his phone, where he had been attempting additional contact with Jessica. "She's not responding anymore. I think she's turned off her phone." "Then we proceed with formal legal action," Patricia declared. "I'll file fraud charges tomorrow morning and request a warrant for the recovery of the jewelry. Jessica's window for voluntary cooperation is closing." Helen gathered her notebook and prepared to leave. "Amanda, there's something else you should know. While we were waiting for the DNA results, I continued investigating Jessica's background. She has a pattern of this behavior. The revelation that Jessica's deception might not be an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern added another dimension to the situation. If she had previously made false paternity claims or manipulated other men through similar schemes, it would strengthen the case for criminal prosecution." "What kind of pattern?" I asked. 2 other men in Phoenix have had similar experiences with Jessica over the past 3 years. Relationships that began with romance, progressed to claims about pregnancy or financial emergencies, and ended with the men discovering they had been systematically deceived, Helen explained. Patricia looked up from her laptop with interest. "Have either of those men filed charges?" "One did, but Jessica disappeared before the case went to trial. The other was convinced to settle privately after she returned some money and jewelry," Helen replied. "I have contact information for both men if we need witnesses to establish a pattern of fraudulent behavior. The evidence that Jessica was Essentially a professional fraud artist who targeted men for financial gain, transformed her relationship with Marcus from a simple affair into something much more calculated and predatory. Marcus hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been the victim of a sophisticated con artist who specialized in exploiting men's emotions for financial benefit. "Marcus," Patricia said, "you need to understand that you were targeted specifically because of your family's wealth and business connections. Jessica researched the Torres family before she ever met you at that networking event." The revelation hit Marcus visibly. His face showed a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension that his affair hadn't been a romantic relationship that went wrong, but a deliberate scheme designed to extract money and establish false family connections for financial gain. "She never cared about me at all," Marcus said quietly, the full implications of his situation finally becoming clear. "No," Helen replied bluntly, "she didn't. You were a means to an end. And the end was access to Torres family money through false pregnancy claims." As the meeting concluded and everyone prepared to leave, I realized that Jessica Walsh's fraudulent pregnancy announcement had inadvertently exposed truths that might have remained hidden for years. Marcus's embezzlement would have continued. Jessica's manipulation would have escalated, and the Torres family would have gradually been drained of resources by people who viewed them as targets rather than family. The DNA test results had done more than disprove Jessica's paternity claims. They had revealed the systematic deception that had been undermining the Torres family from within. Marcus would face criminal charges for embezzlement, but he would also be freed from a relationship built entirely on lies and manipulation. Over the following weeks, the legal resolution of the situation unfolded with the methodical precision that Patricia Newman brought to all her cases. Jessica was arrested for fraud after failing to return the jewelry or respond to legal demands. The two previous victims Helen had identified came forward to testify about similar schemes, establishing a pattern that convinced prosecutors to pursue felony charges. Marcus pleaded guilty to embezzlement charges and agreed to full restitution plus penalties totaling nearly $70,000. His guilty plea resulted in probation rather than prison time, but his reputation in Phoenix real estate circles was permanently damaged. Kevin Torres removed him from day-to-day business operations, though he remained a minority shareholder under strict supervision. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward, with Marcus offering no contest to my requests for property division and financial settlement. The emotional betrayal had been devastating, but the revelation that our marriage had been collateral damage in Jessica's fraud scheme provided a strange kind of closure. 6 months after the disastrous birthday barbecue that had changed everything, I found myself sitting by the same pool where Jessica had made her fraudulent announcement, but with a completely different perspective on my life and future. Helen Rodriguez had become not just an ally, but a genuine friend, and Kevin Torres had followed through on his promise to treat me as true family, regardless of my divorce from Marcus. The insurance settlement from Marcus's embezzlement and Jessica's fraud conviction had provided financial security that allowed me to expand my graphic design business and purchase my own home in a quieter neighborhood north of Phoenix. The Torres family fortune that Jessica had tried to access through deception was ultimately protected, but more importantly, the family itself had been strengthened by surviving the crisis together. Jessica Walsh was sentenced to 3 years in prison for fraud, with additional restitution requirements that would follow her for decades. Her scheme to target wealthy families through false pregnancy claims had finally been exposed and stopped, protecting future potential victims from her predatory behavior. Marcus sold his BMW and moved into a modest apartment, beginning the long process of rebuilding a life and career that he had nearly destroyed through poor judgment and criminal behavior. Our conversations were limited to necessary legal matters, but he had expressed genuine remorse for the pain his actions had caused, particularly to his father and me. The most unexpected outcome of the entire situation was the strengthening of my relationship with the Torres family members who had supported me throughout the ordeal. Helen's methodical investigation had not only exposed the truth, but had demonstrated the power of family loyalty when directed toward justice rather than enabling bad behavior. Standing by the pool where Jessica's lies had been exposed, I reflected on how a single moment of public betrayal had ultimately led to truth, justice, and a clearer understanding of who could be trusted in times of crisis. The champagne glass that had shattered that terrible afternoon had been replaced, but the lessons learned from its breaking would last a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.